What would you do if you had just 12 hours to build a home or freeze to death? Not in a cozy suburb, not with lumber waiting at the store, not with neighbors close enough to lend a hand. No, imagine yourself in the raw, untouched heart of the American wilderness. It's the year 1834. The ground beneath you is frozen. The wind bites like knives, and on the western horizon a storm is brewing fast, merciless, and without pity. You have an axe, a rifle, and the hard-earned knowledge of your trade. That's all. No nails, no sawmill, no backup plan. In 12 hours' time, night will fall, the snow will descend, and your life will depend on what you can build with your bare hands. This was the reality for the men we call mountain men, frontiersmen, who carved their existence into the hostile backbone of North America. The land where this story unfolds is not the Montana you see today. In 1834, it was unbroken country, a labyrinth of rivers, towering pines, jagged peaks, and valleys cut deep by glaciers. Herds of buffalo thundered across plains, wolves prowled the edges of campfires, and grizzly bears ruled the forests with unchallenged dominance. The nearest fort, perhaps 200 miles away, was no guarantee of safety or even survival. Travel was slow, dangerous, and uncertain. To be alone here was to be at the mercy of nature, and nature was rarely merciful. The Blackfeet roamed these mountains. To them, this was sacred land, and every intruder a trespasser. For trappers and wanderers, encounters could end in trade, or in blood. And yet men came, wave after wave, lured by something stronger than fear. Between 1800 and 1850, some 20,000 men, most young, most restless, struck out into this unclaimed wilderness. They came from farms in Kentucky, villages in Pennsylvania, cities along the Atlantic coast. Some were veterans of wars who could not return to plow and village life. Others were runaways, dreamers, fugitives, men who wanted nothing to do with the laws and limits of civilization. All of them had heard whispers of fortune. Beaver pelts fetched high prices in Europe and the East, where felt hats were in fashion. One pelt could mean days of food. A pack mule laden with furs could mean a year's wages back east, to the poor. And the ambitious, it was a siren's call. But pelts were only part of the story. For many, the wilderness itself was the reward. To live unchained, to test body and spirit against mountains and storms, to rely on nothing but your own skill. This was a life as raw and untamed as the land itself. It was hardship, yes, but also freedom, a freedom few men ever tasted, and fewer survived. Mountain men traveled light. They had to. Everything had to be hauled on their back or on the back of a mule. Their kit was brutally simple: an axe for wood and building, a rifle, often a flintlock or a percussion cap by the 1830s, for hunting and defense, powder horn, shot, knife, a few traps for beaver, flint and steel for fire, a kettle, a blanket, maybe a handful of parched cornmeal or jerky. No tents, no luxuries. If shelter was needed, it had to be built, and built fast. Think of that. A modern home, we are surrounded by conveniences. But a mountain man's entire existence was contained in perhaps 30 pounds of gear. And with those tools, he was expected to face grizzlies, storms, hunger, and months of isolation. Now picture our mountain man in Montana, 1834. He has been trapping along a frozen creek, his breath curling into clouds of white in the sharp air. For weeks he has slept beneath trees, wrapped in little more than a buffalo hide. But the sky has shifted. The wind has turned sharp, and the mountain's silence has changed its voice. A storm is coming. Not a gentle snowfall, but a wall of ice and wind that could strip the life out of a man in hours. The only hope is shelter. Not a lean-to, not a hollow log, but a cabin strong enough to withstand days of howling winds and snow that piles higher than a man's waist. And here is the measure of grit. The mountain man has just 12 hours of workable daylight to build it. 12 hours to find the right spot, fell the right trees, notch and stack logs, raise walls, and lay a roof strong enough to keep the storm from tearing the life out of him. This was not theory. This was not some imagined exercise. For mountain men, the stakes were life or death, and the odds were cruel. A single miscalculation, choosing the wrong tree that falls the wrong way, wasting hours hauling logs too heavy to lift, building too far from water, or failing to seal a gap in the wall could mean freezing in the dark. Survival demanded more than muscle. It demanded knowledge passed from one trapper to another, instinct sharpened by years, and the sheer will to keep working when the body cried out for rest. And here is the truth. Most of us today, even with modern axes, warm clothing, and emergency kits, would not survive that first night. But mountain men did. Again and again they clawed life out of the wilderness. One log, one notch, one spark of fire at a time. Over the course of this story, we will follow one man as he does exactly that. We will walk with him as he scouts the land for a cabin site, as he tests the trees and reads their lean. We will feel the sting of sweat in freezing air as he swings his axe. We will hear the crack of wood splintering, the grunt as logs roll into place. We will see how he transforms raw forest into walls, into a roof, into a fireplace that draws smoke just enough to keep the room breathable, and he will not remain alone. For in the wilderness, survival was often a matter of unlikely alliances. Two strangers fellow trappers will arrive, and together they will raise the cabin higher and stronger. This was the paradox of mountain men, fiercely independent, but at times utterly dependent on the hands of another. The storm will come, and it will test everything they have built. The cabin will stand, or it will fail. Inside, men will share warmth, food, and the fragile comfort of knowing they are not alone. Outside, the wilderness will rage, indifferent, unyielding. This is not merely a tale of one storm or one cabin. It is the story of human ingenuity at its purest, of men who understood wood and stone, wind and snow, in ways we have largely forgotten. It is a reminder that survival is not just physical, it is psychological. A cabin is not only walls against the cold. It is a fortress of the mind, a place where hope can breathe and loneliness can be endured. And as we journey through this narrative, we'll uncover lessons etched into history: how to read a tree, how to trap for food, how to manage firewood, how to seal cracks with moss and mud. We'll see not just how mountain men survived, but how they mastered the wilderness, leaving behind cabins that in some cases still stand today, silent monuments to resilience. So ask yourself again, what would you do if you had 12 hours? To build a home or die in the storm? This is not just a story of logs and snow. It is a story of determination, of grit, of men who lived on the knife edge of survival. And as we step into the year 1834, into the frozen valleys of Montana, we are about to see how a single cabin, built from nothing, became the difference between life and death. The journey begins. Who were the mountain men? In truth, they were not a single breed of man, nor were they saints or villains alone. They were a mixture patchwork of runaway farm boys, hardened soldiers, restless adventurers, and men carrying secrets they hoped the wilderness would bury. Between 1800 and 1850, roughly 20,000 of them ventured into the unclaimed frontier. To some, they were reckless wanderers. To others, they were explorers, heroes, and the first architects of the American West. The image we often picture, hair, fringed buckskin, rifle slung over a shoulder, was not just legend. It was reality. These men wore what they could make or trade. They stitched coats from deer hide, wrapped moccasins around their feet, and carried powder horns carved with initials and crude maps. Each man became his own outfitter, tailor, and armorer, because the wilderness offered no stores, no resupply, no safety nets. Why did they go? Most were drawn by the lure of beaver pelts. In the early 1800s, European fashion was ruled by the felt hat. Paris, London, and New York demanded millions of pelts each year, and the wilderness of the Rockies was thick with beaver. A single pelt could buy a man days of food. A pack horse loaded with skins could mean a small fortune. But beyond money, there was something deeper. Some men were restless souls who could not tolerate fences, farms, or city laws. Some were veterans of the War of 1812, unable to return to plough fields after tasting the life of battle. Others were drifters, wanted men, or those crushed by debts back east. Out here, in the high country, a man could vanish into the map's blank spaces. Out here, you answered to no sheriff, no landlord, no master, only to the mountains, the rivers, and the seasons. It was not freedom as we know it today. It was a harsher freedom, for with liberty came exposure, hunger, and constant risk. Every sunrise could be your last, and yet the call of the wilderness was irresistible. The hardships of mountain men were relentless. Starvation was the most common enemy. Trapping seasons stretched for months, often in brutal winter cold. A man might go weeks with little more than dried meat or what he could shoot. Coffee, if he had it, was treasured. Salt was worth fighting for, and if supplies ran out, there was no running to a market. You ate what the land gave or you wasted away. The weather itself was merciless. Winters in Montana or Wyoming could drop to 40 below. Snow came thick, heavy, and endless. Storms swept through without warning, tearing down camps and freezing rivers solid. In summer, heat baked the valleys, and swarms of mosquitoes rose in clouds so dense they blackened the air. A man was rarely comfortable. He was either freezing, sweating, starving, or healing from wounds. And wounds were many. Every step in the mountains carried risk. A fall from a wet rock, a broken leg while hunting, a stray cut from an axe. These were not inconveniences. They could be death sentences. Infection lurked in every injury. There were no doctors, no medicines beyond herbs and whiskey. A man learned to stitch his own flesh, to set his own bones, or he did not survive long. Beyond hunger and weather, there were the beasts. Grizzly bears roamed the Rockies in numbers unimaginable today. 12 feet tall when standing, faster than a horse over short distances, they were nightmares made flesh. Many mountain men carried scars of bear encounters. Some wore them as badges of survival. Wolves hunted in packs. Cougars stalked silently, appearing like shadows at the edge of firelight. Rattlesnakes lay hidden in tall grass. Even the beaver, small, seemingly harmless, could bite through a man's hand with teeth sharp as chisels. And yet, nature was not just enemy, it was also provider. Mountain men developed what seemed like a sixth sense, the ability to read tracks, smell weather on the wind, know when elk would migrate or where berries ripened. They lived by these signs. To survive, they had to become part of the wilderness, blending into it until they could not be separated from the land itself. And then there were the people. The West was not empty. The Blackfeet, Crow, Shoshone, and countless other tribes had lived here for centuries. Encounters with mountain men varied. Some ended in trade, in shared hunts, even in marriages that bound cultures together. Others ended in ambush, bloodshed, or fear. To some tribes, the trappers were trespassers, invaders. To others, they were partners in trade. A mountain man had to tread carefully, for alliances shifted with the seasons. Still, many mountain men owed their survival to native tribes. From them they learned to tan hides, to craft moccasins that outlasted boots, to build snowshoes, to read the land more deeply. Without this shared knowledge, many more would have perished. But perhaps the hardest enemy of all was not weather, beast, or hunger. It was isolation. Months could pass without the sight of another human face. Imagine the silence, days with only the wind and the crack of ice, nights with only the sound of wolves calling across the valley. For some men, it was freedom. For others, it was madness. Journals speak of men talking to their rifles, carving messages into trees, or keeping careful count of days to remind themselves that time still moved. Loneliness gnawed at the spirit as harshly as cold gnawed at the flesh. This isolation forged strange bonds when men did meet. Rendezvous gatherings in the summer became lifelines. For a few weeks, mountain men would pour into pelts, swapping stories, drinking, and celebrating survival. And then, just as quickly, they vanished again, scattering into the mountains. Alone once more. Today, the mountain man is often seen as legend, a romantic figure of freedom and wildness. But the truth was more complicated. They were not always noble. Some drank heavily, some cheated in trade, some left wreckage behind them. They were not all giants of courage. Many died young, some were forgotten, their bones left unburied beneath pine needles and snow. But what unites them, across all flaws, was an endurance beyond imagining. To step into the wilderness with so little, and to carve out life where life was not meant to thrive, that was their mark. And so we return to Montana. 1834. A single man stands at the edge of a clearing, axe in hand, rifle slung across his shoulder. He has been weeks in the cold, his clothes worn, his supplies low. The sky darkens with the weight of an approaching storm. He knows what is coming. He knows he has only hours to act. The hardships of his life, starvation, predators, loneliness, all been preparing him for this moment. Tonight, survival depends on one thing. Can he build a cabin from nothing before the storm descends? This is where the true test begins. The wind had changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the way the trees whispered, a new bite in the air that sliced through layers of hide and wool. The mountain man stopped in his tracks, snow crunching beneath his moccasins, and turned, his face to the western horizon. Over the far ridges, the sky was a heavy steel grey. Clouds, thick and low, pressed forward like a slow-moving army. A storm was coming. Not a passing flurry, not a gentle blanket of white. This was a storm that promised death to the unprepared. He knew the signs. He had seen storms swallow valleys whole, burying men, animals. and even rivers beneath drifts taller than a man's shoulders. He had felt the stillness that came before the first blast of wind, and he had heard the sound, the low, distant roar that told of blizzards racing down mountainsides faster than a man could run. He had perhaps 12 hours, no more. By nightfall, the land would be locked in ice and snow. The only hope was shelter, and shelter meant a cabin. Not a palace, not a thing of beauty, but 4 walls, a roof, and a firebox to keep him alive. Every decision he made in the next hour, where to build, which trees to cut, how to orient the walls, would decide if he survived the storm or joined the countless bones scattered across the wilderness. The first rule of wilderness shelter was simple: choose the ground wisely. Too close to water, and the spring thaw would flood you out. Too far, and hauling water each day would bleed the strength from your body. Too exposed, and wind would tear the roof away. Too hidden, and predators or enemies could creep upon you unseen. Every option was a trade-off, and every trade-off carried risk. He studied the valley around him. A narrow creek wound its way along the bottom, its edges glazed with ice. Beyond it, the land rose in a gentle slope to a stand of tall pines. To the east, a rocky ridge provided some shelter from the prevailing wind. To the west, open meadow, in summer, deadly in winter. He traced the line of the creek with his eyes. Yes, here, near the tree line, on a slight rise above the water. Close enough to fetch water with little effort, but high enough to stay dry. The ridge would break the wind, and the trees would provide logs within easy reach. He nodded to himself. This was the place. No cabin could be built on tangled brush. He pulled his axe from its loop and set to work, chopping down scrub willows and hacking through frozen undergrowth. Each swing of the axe bit into wood with a sharp crack that echoed through the valley. Steam rose from his body as sweat mixed with the cold air. His breath came hard, but there was no time to rest. Every moment lost was a moment stolen by the storm. The ground had to be level. He scraped away snow with his boots, stamping it down until a flat surface emerged. Stones protruded from the earth, and he pried them loose with his axe blade, setting the larger ones aside. Those stones would not be wasted. They would form the foundation of a fireplace before the night was done. The cabin would live or die on the quality of its logs. The mountain man stepped into the trees, eyes scanning the stand of pines. He was not looking for the biggest or the tallest. He was looking for the right ones. A good cabin log had to be straight, free of rot, thick enough to block wind, but not so massive it would crush a man's strength. He circled one pine, laying a hand on its bark. The lean of the trunk, the direction of its branches, even the feel of its grain told him how it would fall. This was an art, not a science. Mountain men developed a near supernatural sense of trees. Choose wrong, and the tree might twist as it fell, pinning you beneath its weight. Choose right, and it would crash clean, ready for limbing and hauling. He marked 3 with his axe blade, then set his stance. The sound of an axe in the wilderness is unlike any other. It rings sharp, echoing against the mountains, announcing man's presence where silence once ruled. He swung in steady rhythm, biting deep into the pine. Chips flew, scattering across snow like yellow petals. His shoulders burned, arms trembled, but he kept the rhythm, left, right, left, right. The notch widened. Sap oozed, freezing on contact with the cold air. At last, the tree groaned. The fibers stretched, the trunk shivered, and with a thunderous crack it gave way. The pine toppled, slow at first, Then, with gathering force, smashing branches as it fell, snow billowed up as it struck the ground, the sound rolling through the valley like distant thunder. The mountain man paused, chest heaving, and listened. No echoing crash of another tree falling. No sound of predators stirred from their dens. Safe. For now, he moved quickly to limb the tree, swinging the axe with shorter strokes to clear branches. Each limb became fuel for fire, every scrap of wood precious. Then, with effort, he began the back-breaking work of stripping bark, leaving the log bare and ready to serve as a wall. Hours passed in relentless labor. 3, 4, 5 logs fell beneath his axe, each one limbed, bark peeled, ends squared. His body screamed for rest, but rest was impossible. The sun had begun its slow descent. Shadows stretched long across the snow. The storm was closer now, the horizon swallowed in a wall of grey. Time was running short. He had to move faster. No cabin could stand without a strong base. The mountain man dragged 2 logs into place, laying them parallel on the frozen ground. These would form the sill, beams the bones of the cabin. He cut notches at their ends, careful to make them deep enough for logs to interlock, but shallow enough to keep the strength. Precision mattered. A poor notch meant gaps, gaps meant drafts, and drafts meant death in a winter storm. The first logs rolled into place, fitting snugly. He could almost see the outline of the cabin now, a rectangle no larger than 12 by 14 feet, barely room to stretch out. But size was a luxury he could not afford. Smaller meant faster to build, easier to heat, and harder for the storm to tear apart. As he worked, the wilderness pressed in. Crows circled overhead, black flecks against the grey sky. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled. The sound was long, mournful, and it carried a reminder. He was not alone. Predators watched, waiting for weakness. A man bent to his labor was an easy target, but he had no choice. The axe must swing, the logs must fall, or the storm would kill him long before wolves could. Every movement he made carried layers of knowledge, not written in books, but passed from trapper to trapper, learned in bruises and scars. How to choose a site sheltered but not smothered. How to judge a tree's fall. How to notch and fit logs without wasting energy. None of it was luck. All of it was survival. And yet, even with skill, there was no guarantee. Many had tried, and many had failed. Their unfinished shelters now buried beneath snow, forgotten but for the bones left behind. By late afternoon, the first wall was rising, 3 logs high. His arms trembled with exhaustion, his body slick with sweat beneath frozen hides. The storm loomed now, blotting out the last light of day. Soon the wind would howl, snow would fall, and his half-built cabin would be tested. But before walls could stand, before a roof could rise, there was more to be done. More trees to fell, more logs to fit, and perhaps, before the night was through, help might arrive or not, because in the wilderness you built with your own hands, or you froze alone. The cabin was only an outline on the ground. 2 sill logs, a rough rectangle traced in snow. But walls would not rise themselves. They would come from the tree's towering pines and sturdy spruces that loomed just beyond the clearing. Each log had to be chosen, felled, trimmed, stripped, and dragged into place. Each log was a world of labor on its own, and he needed dozens. The mountain man paused, leaning on his axe, listening to his own breath. His arms were heavy, shoulders tight from hours of chopping. He glanced at the sky. The storm was closer now, smudging the horizon in grey and swallowing the far peaks in white haze. He had maybe 8 hours of daylight left. 8 hours to do the work of a crew. 8 hours to build walls strong enough to shield him from the storm that would bury the valley. His body said it was impossible. His will said otherwise. To fell a tree was not just brute strength. It was knowledge, honed by years of watching how wood grew and how it fell. A good woodsman read trees like another man might read books. The lean of a trunk told him which way it wanted to fall. The spread of branches showed where weight pulled. The grain of bark whispered if rot hid within. Even the wind had a voice in the matter, pushing against the balance. He stepped before a pine nearly 2 feet thick. Its crown swayed slightly toward the open meadow. Perfect. It would fall clean. No chance of snagging another trunk. He set his boots firmly, spat into the snow, and raised the axe. The axe struck with a crack that echoed through the trees. Then again, the rhythm was steady. Left, right, left, right, right. Chips of pale wood sprayed outward, scattering across the snow. The smell of resin filled the air, sharp and almost sweet. His muscles burned, but rhythm was everything. Not too hard, not too wild. Not too wild, each strike had to land in the same place, deepening the notch that guided the tree's fall. Minutes stretched, breath clouded, sweat dripped beneath his cap. The pine groaned, fibers stretching, creaking with every swing. He widened the cut, then moved to the opposite side, chopping a back cut slightly higher. It was dangerous work. A tree could twist, splinter, or kick back with force enough to crush bone. He trusted his sense, his experience. Finally, with a shiver that ran from roots to crown, the pine gave way. It leaned slowly at first, then with a rush of power it fell. Branches snapped like rifle fire. Snow exploded in a white cloud. The ground trembled. The mountain man stepped back, chest heaving, eyes watching until the forest grew still again. 1 tree down, dozens to go. The work did not end with felling. The tree lay before him like a giant carcass, needing to be dismembered. He swung the axe in quick chops, severing branches one by one. Each limb was fuel, each knot a potential weakness. His hands blistered beneath leather gloves, but he worked on. When the trunk was bare, he set to stripping bark. Bark held insects, moisture, rot. Stripped clean, the log would last longer, fit tighter. He wedged the axe blade under the bark and peeled it back, long curls falling to the snow. Dragging came next. With grunts and curses, he heaved the log, rolling it over snow, inch by inch toward the cabin site. Alone, he could not lift such weight, but with leverage ropes, branches as rollers, the frozen ground itself, he made progress. Slow, agonizing progress. Every movement drained him, but quitting was not an option. Without walls, he would die. Time dissolved into rhythm. Swing, chop, strip, drag. The sun arced lower. His arms shook with fatigue, back screaming from strain. His stomach growled, but he had no time for more than a strip of jerky chewed between swings. Hunger was a luxury. Shelter was survival. He felled another pine, then another. Each fall sent tremors through the ground, each crash a reminder that the forest was shrinking, one log at a time, into the shape of a home. His pile of logs grew beside the clearing, rough and raw, ready to become walls. Yet with every log, his body weakened. His palms bled through the gloves, raw skin stinging. In the cold, his breath rasped, shallow and fast. He paused only long enough to catch himself, then raised the axe again, because every pause was stolen by the storm. The air had shifted. It was colder now, sharper. Snowflakes drifted on the wind, just a few, scattered like scouts before an advancing army. The storm was near. He felt it in his bones, in the ache of his joints, in the way the birds had fallen silent. Time was running out. The cabin walls had to rise higher, at least shoulder height before night. Otherwise, the wind would shear through, filling the shelter with snow. He swung harder, faster, teeth clenched. Fatigue was nothing compared to the cost of failure. As he worked, his mind wandered to those who had come before. He remembered older trappers telling tales at rendezvous, how to notch a corner so tight no draught slipped through, how to select trees that would season well, how to work smarter, not just harder. Every trick mattered, like angling cuts to use gravity and dragging, like saving saplings to lash logs together, like leaving one corner slightly open to channel smoke until a chimney could be built. Knowledge passed mouth to ear, hand to hand. Knowledge that separated the living from the frozen dead. Every swing of his axe carried that inheritance. He was not alone. Behind him stood generations of men who had wrestled with wood and snow, who had fought storms with nothing but muscle and will. Their lessons lived in his movements, in his instincts, and tonight, those lessons would keep him alive. By mid-afternoon, the first true wall was rising. He rolled logs into place, notching corners so they locked together like puzzle pieces. The rectangle of the cabin grew taller, each log stacked tighter, each seam pressed close. He packed moss and snow between cracks, sealing out drafts as best he could. 3 logs high became 4. 4 became 5. It was rough, uneven, ugly, but it was a wall, and it was shelter. He stopped only to sharpen his axe, running the whetstone across its edge until it gleamed. Then back to the forest, back to the endless rhythm. Fell, limb, strip, drag. His body moved on instinct now, a machine of survival. Mind and muscle blurred into one. Not all went smoothly. One tree fell near the ridge, twisted as it fell, striking another trunk and splintering with a crack like a gunshot. Shards of wood flew through the air, one grazing his shoulder with enough force to tear cloth and skin. He stumbled back, blood warm against the cold air, but did not stop. He bound the cut with a strip of hide and pressed on. Injuries were part of the price. Rest was a luxury he could not afford. Another time, a log rolled unexpectedly, nearly crushing his foot beneath its weight. He leapt clear, heart pounding. A single broken bone would end him here. Every movement carried risk. But risk was the cost of survival. By late afternoon, shadows stretched long across the clearing. The sun sagged toward the horizon, its light dim and cold. The storm loomed larger, swallowing sky and mountain in grey. Snowflakes fell steadily now, melting on his skin before freezing again. The wind picked up, carrying the low howl of what was to come. He had hours, at most, before the blizzard struck full force. The cabin walls stood waist-high, logs interlocked, crude but solid, enough, perhaps, to break the wind. But the roof beams were still a dream. He pushed on, dragging another log into place, arms trembling, lungs burning. He could not stop now. He would not. Darkness was coming, and with it the storm. The walls were rising, but not fast enough. He would need more strength, more hand, something he did not have. Alone, his body was stretched to its breaking point. The wilderness demanded more than one man could give. And yet, there he stood, axe in hand, logs at his feet, eyes locked on the half-built cabin. The storm would test him, and unless fate intervened, he would face it alone. By now, the skeleton of a cabin stood in the clearing. 4 walls of rough-hewn logs, only chest-high, locked together at the corners with crude notches. Gaps still gaped between the logs, stuffed with snow and moss where time allowed. It wasn't much to a stranger. It might look like nothing more than a pile of lumber, a ruin half-started. But to the mountain man, it was everything. It was hope against despair. It was a fragile line drawn between life and death. The wind pressed harder. Now, cutting across the ridge, rattling branches like bones. Snow fell more steadily, drifting against the rising wall. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, sweat freezing instantly to his skin. His muscles screamed, his palms bled. But he had no choice. The walls had to go higher. Building a cabin alone was a feat that broke many men. A single log could weigh hundreds of pounds, heavy enough to crush ribs, shatter bones, or pin a man until wolves found him. With partners, 3 men could shoulder a log and set it in place with grunts and curses. Alone, the mountain man had to rely on cunning. He fashioned levers from saplings, wedging them under logs to pry them upward. He cut forked branches too, act as temporary braces, propping one side while he scrambled to lift the other. Sometimes he used the slope of the ground itself, rolling a log into place by gravity, then locking it with sweat and sheer will. Every move was a gamble. One slip, and the log could roll back. Crushing his legs, he worked in silence, but for the ragged sound of his breath and the crack of ice beneath boots. Each lift stole what strength he had left. Each notch cut into a log took minutes that felt like hours. His body burned, but his mind refused to quit. Solitude does strange things. With no human voice to answer him, the mountain man muttered to the logs, to the axe, to the forest itself. "Hold steady now," he growled as a log teetered on a brace. "Up you go," he whispered, straining to shove it higher. When a log slammed into place, he cursed and laughed in the same breath, half mad with fatigue, half drunk on the small victory. The wilderness gave no reply, only the wind moaning through the trees, as if mocking his struggle. Slowly, painfully, the walls climbed. 4 logs high, 5, then 6. Now the cabin's outline no longer looked like a heap. It began to resemble a true shelter-narrow squat, but solid. The rectangle stood against the storm, its silhouette sharp against the darkening sky. The mountain man stuffed gaps with whatever he could find. Moss, mud, frozen clumps of snow, anything to block drafts. His fingers were numb, his knuckles split and bleeding, but he pressed on. Every sealed crack was a promise of warmth. Every log stacked higher was one less chance the storm would reach his bones. But the mountains do not keep promises. The storm struck before the walls were finished. It came with a howl, a blast of wind that tore through the clearing and staggered him where he stood. Snow fell thick and fast, a curtain of white that swallowed the trees. In minutes, the world vanished into a blur. The half-built cabin became an island in a sea of swirling snow. The air itself turned to knives, cutting into his lungs, freezing the sweat on his skin. The mountain man ducked inside the walls, pressing his back against logs barely high enough to shield him. The storm roared overhead, snow piling against the half-made structure. The roof was not yet built. Wind howled through gaps. The cold pressed in, relentless. This was not shelter. Not yet. He knew what had to be done. He could not stop. Not now. Darkness was hours away, and with it, death. He forced himself back into the storm, dragging another log toward the cabin. The snow fought him, pulling at his legs, numbing his hands, but he heaved and strained, rolling the log into place, notching it with frantic swings of the axe. 7 logs high, then 8. The walls now stood taller than his shoulders, a fortress rising in the blizzard. He shouted into the storm, not words, but raw defiance, a roar torn from lungs already ragged. The wind swallowed his cry, indifferent. But for a moment, he felt stronger. Exhaustion stalked him, his vision blurred. His knees buckled beneath him. The axe slipped in his grip, nearly slicing his thigh. He caught himself against a log, chest heaving, heart pounding in his ears. The world tilted. For a moment, he considered collapsing into the snow, letting the storm take him. It would be easier, warmer even, for a few final moments. But a voice inside, the same stubborn voice that had carried him through hunger, through loneliness, through years of wilderness, snarled back, "Not yet, not like this." He staggered to his feet, bloodied, palms gripping the axe again. By the time night fell, the cabin walls stood 9 logs high. A crude doorway gaped open, covered by nothing but a hanging hide. The roof beams were not yet set, the fireplace not yet built, but it was enough to block the worst of the wind, enough to hold the storm at bay. Inside, the mountain man, huddled, shivering, lighting a small fire in a pit scraped into the ground. Smoke curled, thick and choking without a chimney, but he didn't care. The flames were heat. The walls held the snow back. For tonight, he would live. He lay on pine boughs, staring at the flickering glow. His muscles twitched, spasms of fatigue rolling through his limbs. His hands throbbed, raw and blistered. His face was cracked with cold, but his chest rose and fell. He had survived the first test. Tomorrow, the work would continue. Tomorrow, the roof must rise. But tonight, he closed his eyes to the howl of the storm outside, and he dreamed not of death, but of shelter. In the wilderness, no man survives alone forever. Somewhere out in the blizzard, 2 figures trudged through snow, drawn by the glow of smoke in the valley. Strangers, yet fellow survivors. They would arrive soon, and when they did, the lonely labor of one man would become the shared effort of 3. But for now, in the fragile silence of his half-built cabin, the mountain man slept, axe by his side, fire at his feet, and storm raging just beyond the walls. Tomorrow, the battle would begin again. The storm had swallowed the valley whole. Wind roared like a living beast, hurling snow in waves that blotted out even the nearest trees. From within the half-built cabin, the mountain man crouched near his fire, feeding it splinters of pine. Smoke curled against the low log walls, stinging his eyes. His body trembled uncontrollably, hunger gnawing deeper than any wolf's teeth. He was alive, but barely. The walls stood tall enough to break the wind. Yet the storm's fury still found cracks, driving icy breaths into the shelter. The roof beams remained unfinished, and every gust threatened to undo what little progress he had made. Alone, he would last only so long. But he was not alone. Out beyond the swirling white, 2 shadows trudged through knee-deep drifts. They had been hunting lines of a creek when the storm hit, and like all men of the wilderness, they searched instinctively. For fire, smoke meant life, smoke meant shelter. And so, step by step, half frozen, they followed the faint column of grey rising into the blizzard, toward the glow, toward the half-built cabin, toward a stranger who, in this moment, would become a lifeline. The first knock was not on the door, for there was no door yet, but on the wall itself. A fist thumping against frozen logs. The mountain man sprang up, rifle in hand, instinctively, ready, but the voices that cut through the storm were no enemies. "Ho there, we saw your smoke. Let us in, or we'll freeze where we stand." The mountain man hesitated. Trust was scarce in the Rockies. Strangers could mean theft, violence, even death. But survival had its own laws, and tonight those laws demanded mercy. He shoved the hide covering aside, and two men stumbled in, trailing snow like ghosts. They were trappers by their look faces, raw with cold. Clothes patched with fur and hide, rifles slung across their backs. One was broad-shouldered, with a beard thick with ice. The other was lean, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. Both collapsed near the fire with grateful groans, holding out trembling hands to the flames. For a moment, no words passed between them. Only the hiss of snow melting from coats, the crackle of firewood, the ragged sound of breath returning to lungs. Then the broad-shouldered man spoke. "You alone here?" The mountain man nodded. "Not anymore," the lean one said, pulling a strip of dried venison from his pouch and tossing it into the fire for warmth. Just like that. The cabin held 3. There was no formal agreement, no handshake, no written contract. None was needed. In the wilderness, survival itself was the bond. Each man knew the truth. One alone could not finish the cabin before the storm buried them, but 3, working together, might. The mountain man divided the space without ceremony. One side of the fire for them, one for him. Supplies laid out in the open so no suspicions lingered. He passed them a pouch of parched corn. They shared strips of jerky in return. The unspoken pact was clear. Food, warmth, and work would be shared until the storm broke. By dawn, the storm was still raging, but the fire had burned steady through the night. The 3 men rose, stiff and sore, but alive. Outside, snow had piled nearly waist-high against the cabin walls. If they did not finish the roof soon, the weight of snow would collapse the structure together. They went to work. The broad-shouldered trapper set to felling trees. His axe rang out through the muffled air, each swing sending chips flying, each crash of falling timber shaking snow from branches. The lean one trimmed and stripped the logs, moving with quick precision, turning raw trunks into usable beams. The mountain man, their reluctant host, directed the work dragging logs into place, notching corners, overseeing the fit of each wall. He had already laid the skeleton. Now, with help, flesh could be added faster than one man's body could ever manage. The work was brutal. Logs were heavy. The snow resisted every drag, and the storm fought them at every turn. But 3 pairs of hands made what had seemed impossible, only hours before, possible. By noon, the cabin walls had climbed to full height. By dusk, the roof beams stretched across the span, lashed with saplings, ready to hold branches and hides as makeshift cover. Slowly, the cabin ceased to be a skeleton and began to breathe like a living thing. Logs locked tight, gaps filled with moss and mud, a frame strong enough to shoulder the weight of snow, a roof that, though crude, offered true protection against the storm. Inside, the men built a raised platform from spare logs, laying pine boughs across it to keep bodies off. The frozen ground They stacked wood by the fire pit, knowing that fuel was as vital as food. Every improvement, every addition, felt like a small miracle. The storm still howled outside, but within those four walls, there was warmth, there was shelter, there was survival. That night, the three men sat close by the fire, steam rising from drying clothes. They spoke little at first, but silence in the wilderness is a heavy thing. Words came eventually. The broad man was named Caleb, once a farm boy from Ohio, who had fled debts and an arranged marriage to chase fortune in the mountains. The lean one was Eli, son of a preacher from Kentucky, drawn west by dreams of freedom from the pulpit's shadow. Each had his reasons for being here, reasons that mattered little now, for in this moment, they were simply three men against the storm. Their differences vanished in the crackle of fire, in the passing of a shared flask, in the quiet knowledge that without one another, none would see spring. They laughed at small things, a log that smoked too much, a tale of near escape from, a grizzly, a memory of rendezvous dances in summer meadows. The laughter was rough, but it warmed them as much as the flames. Yet even as companionship bloomed, all three knew the truth. Alliances in the mountains were never permanent. A man might share his fire tonight, his food tomorrow, but when the storm passed, each would return to his own trail. Trust went only as far as necessity. Beyond that, the wilderness demanded independence, and so they did not speak of the future, only of the work, the storm, the fire, only of survival now. By morning, the snow had eased, but the cold deepened. The cabin walls stood firm, but a fire without a chimney filled the shelter with choking smoke. Eyes watered, lungs burned. They knew the next task was critical. Build a stone fireplace. Carve a chimney that would draw the smoke out and the heat in together. They scavenged rocks from the creek bed, hauling them one by one, hands freezing, against the icy stones. With mud and clay, they stacked them into a crude firebox. Eli angled the stones carefully, remembering a trick taught by a crow. Elder tilt them inward, so heat reflected into the room instead of out. Caleb packed mud tight between gaps. The mountain man shaped a rising column of stone and mud into a chimney, praying it would hold. When they lit the fire that night, the smoke curled upward, drawn by the draft. The cabin breathed for the first time, warm and clear. The men cheered, their voices echoing off logged walls. This was not just shelter anymore, it was home. The storm outside eased into silence, leaving the valley buried beneath snow. The cabin stood, crude and small, but alive. Inside, three men slept in warmth, bellies filled with shared venison, firelight, dancing against log walls. For now, they had triumphed. But the wilderness was not finished testing them. Winter had only just begun, and the work of survival never ended. Yet one truth was clear: without this brief alliance, without three pairs of hands and hearts, the cabin would never have risen. Alone, the mountain man might have frozen in the storm. Together, they had built not just walls, but a fortress against the wild. The fire was alive, but it was killing them. Inside the cabin, flames licked pine boughs, casting a golden glow across rough logged walls. Yet every lungful of air was heavy with choking smoke. It stung their eyes, clawed at their throats, filled the small space until vision blurred and coughing shook their ribs. Three men sat hunched, trying to breathe low to the floor where the smoke thinned. But it was no way to survive. The broad-shouldered Caleb spat into the fire. "This'll choke us dead before the storm gets a chance." The lean trapper, Eli, nodded, his face streaked with soot. The mountain man said nothing. He stared at the curling smoke, his mind racing. He knew what had to be done. A cabin without a chimney was not a home. It was a coffin. Building a fireplace was far harder than stacking logs. A wall of wood could be raised with brute strength. A chimney demanded knowledge angles, airflow, the subtle dance of fire and draft. Build it wrong, and smoke would pour inside, suffocating them. Build it sloppy, and sparks would escape into the log walls, turning the cabin into a funeral pyre. But build it right, and fire would become their greatest ally. Warmth, light, a place to cook meat and boil water, a heart for the home. The cabin would breathe, and so would they. The three men rose at first light, the storm easing into a pale stillness. The valley lay buried under feet of snow, but the creek still trickled beneath its frozen skin. They hacked through ice, pried loose stones, and carried them back to the cabin, one by one. Fingers numbed, backs ached. Some stones were so heavy it took 2 men to drag them across the snow. Each rock was precious, each one a building block against the cold. Caleb strong as an ox hauled the largest boulders. Eli searched for flat stones, sharp-eyed for the shapes that could fit like puzzle pieces. The mountain man carried clay and mud, scooping it with numb hands to use as mortar dot by midday. A growing pile of stone lay beside the cabin wall, waiting to become more than just rubble. Inside, they scraped away earth at one end of the cabin, digging a shallow pit for the firebox. The mountain man knelt, setting the first stones with care. Foundation stones had to be steady, level, strong enough to bear the weight of the chimney above. He pressed mud between gaps, sealing them tight. Caleb lowered a flat slab into place. That'll hold. Eli angled another stone, narrowing the space toward the back. Fire'll bounce heat inward this way. Bit by bit, the firebox took shape. A square no larger than 3 feet across, rising from the dirt floor toward the log wall. Stones stacked, mud pressed, gaps sealed. Smoke blackened their faces as they worked, but slowly the shape of a hearth emerged. The true test was the chimney. It had to rise above the roofline, tall enough to draw smoke upward, not inward. Too short, and smoke would curl back inside. Too wide, and heat would be lost. Too narrow, and fire would choke. The mountain man remembered tales told at rendezvous. Chimneys that collapsed mid-storm, cabins filled with sparks, men found suffocated beside fires they themselves had built. He had no margin for error. Together they stacked stones upward, narrowing the shaft as it rose. Mud sealed each seam, fingers raw from pressing it tight. Branches lashed logs in place to brace the structure. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the chimney climbed at last. It pierced the roof, line crude uneven, but standing. The moment of truth came at dusk. They piled wood in the new hearth, lit it, and crouched back in silence. The flames leaped, crackling, devouring resin and bark. Smoke rose, thick, but this time it curled upward into the chimney. Slowly, steadily, it vanished into the shaft, pulled outside by the draft. For the first time since the storm began, the cabin breathed. The 3 men erupted in laughter, rough and ragged. Caleb slapped the mountain man on the shoulder. Eli grinned. Through soot, the smoke thinned, leaving air they could breathe, eyes that could see, lungs that no longer clawed for air. The fire no longer threatened to kill them. It promised to keep them alive. Around that fire, the men sat in silence, watching sparks rise and vanish into the chimney. Each knew what this meant. In the wilderness, fire was not just warmth, it was survival itself. It boiled water, cooked meat, dried hides, hardened tools. It warded off wolves and cougars. It lit the night when darkness pressed too close, but more than that, it gave hope. A man alone in the wilderness could endure hunger, cold, even loneliness. But without fire, he was nothing more than meat waiting for winter to claim him. Now, with the fireplace roaring, the cabin was no longer a coffin. It was a sanctuary. The chimney was only the beginning. The men set about shaping the fire's role in their lives. They built a rack above the flames to dry wet moccasins and mittens. They fashioned a spit to roast meat. They stacked split wood along the wall, careful to keep it dry, for green wood would smoke and choke them anew. They tested the chimney again and again, adjusting stones until the draft pulled steady. Every adjustment mattered, every curve, every angle they learned by trial, by error, by the sting of smoke in their eyes. Slowly, the fireplace became more than stone. It became craft, knowledge carved into rock and mud. That night, the storm still raged outside. Snow piled high against the walls, wind howled through cracks, but inside, the cabin was warm. Flames danced, smoke rose cleanly, and for the first time, the three men could sit upright without choking. Caleb stretched his legs with a groan. Feels like a king's hall now. Eli smirked, tossing another log onto the fire. If kings lived on jerky and snow water, the mountain man said nothing. He only stared into the flames, watching light flicker across rough-hewn logs. For weeks he had been alone, every breath a battle. Now, with fire roaring in a hearth of their own making, he felt something he had not dared to feel, permanence. Not comfort, not luxury, but a place that could endure. What they had done was more than construction. It was mastery of an element. Fire was not conquered, was partnered with, coaxed into service by stone and skill. In that moment, they joined the long line of men who had learned to bend fire's wild spirit into hearth and home. And in the wilderness, that difference meant life. As night deepened, the storm pressed against the cabin walls, rattling the roof, piling snow higher. But inside, warmth spread, shadows danced, sparks whispered upward into the chimney. The three men lay on pine boughs, wrapped in hides, bellies warmed by roasted venison. For the first time since the storm had begun, sleep came easily. The cabin had a heart now, a place where men and fire coexisted, where smoke rose harmlessly into the sky, and where survival no longer felt like borrowed time. Tomorrow, more work would come, sealing gaps, finishing the roof, building a floor. But tonight, the cabin stood, alive with firelight, defiant against the wilderness. And in that defiance, the men slept soundly. Morning broke with a deceptive stillness. The sky was pale, the valley cloaked in silence, as though the world itself had stopped breathing. The three men stepped outside their cabin, boots sinking deep into the snow. The air was heavy, pressing down on lungs with a weight that felt unnatural. They knew this silence. It was not peace. It was warning. Birds were gone. No ravens circled, no small wings flitted in the trees. Even the creek was quiet, its icy skin unbroken. The wilderness had stilled, bracing itself for what was to come. Caleb muttered, voice low and grim, "She's cumin, biggest one yet." By midday, the wind began. It came as a whisper at first, sighing through the pines. Then it grew into a moan, bending branches, lifting loose snow into ghostly swirls. The three men worked fast, reinforcing what they could, dragging more wood inside, stacking it high by the hearth, piling snow against the outer walls to act as insulation, lashing hides tighter across the roof beams. Every movement was rushed, frantic, as though the storm's breath was already on their necks. And then it arrived. The wind struck like a wall, slamming into the cabin with a force that rattled logs in their notches. Snow fell in sheets, blinding, relentless. In minutes, the world beyond the doorway vanished, replaced by a curtain of white. The storm had come, and it would not relent. The cabin became a fortress under siege. The wind screamed, howling down the chimney like a banshee. Smoke whirled and curled, sucked and pushed by the storm's fury. The fire sputtered but held, flames. Licking defiantly at the woodpile, snow forced its way through cracks, sifting down in ghostly drifts inside. Eli stuffed moss into gaps, fingers numb and bleeding. Caleb pressed his bulk against the doorhide, bracing it against the wind's pull. The mountain man fed the fire, his face lit in alternating flashes of orange flame and grey smoke. Outside, the blizzard roared. Inside, three men fought for every breath of warmth. Hours passed, marked only by the dull rhythm of feeding wood into the hearth. Then came a new sound, deep groaning creak from overhead. Snow was piling thick on the roof, heavier by the minute. Logs strained. The cabin shuddered. Caleb cursed and grabbed a pole, jabbing upward through the roof to shift weight. Snow tumbled off, but more followed, driven by the gale. The roof bowed, then held, then bowed again. It was a battle of endurance, wood and sinew against storm and ice. The mountain man stared upward, jaw clenched. If the roof goes, we're done. The fire was their lifeline, but it was also danger. Sparks leapt with every gust of wind down. The chimney, one stray ember against the dry log walls, and the cabin would become a pyre in seconds. Eli built a stone shield, rearranging the hearth to block stray sparks. Caleb fetched wet hides from their packs, laying them near the fire, ready to smother flames if disaster struck. They were men caught between two deaths, freeze if the fire failed, burn if it raged uncontrolled, and still they tended it, still they fed it, because without fire the storm would win. Night fell, though none could tell when. The blizzard turned, the world black and white, day indistinguishable from dusk, dusk indistinguishable from midnight. Inside, the men lost sense of time. They worked, they dozed in turns, they worked coughing from smoke or from the cabin's violent shakes. The wind was alive, shrieking and clawing at every seam. It sounded like voices, sometimes screams, laughter, whispers, carried by the gale. In the half-dream state of exhaustion, the men heard things that weren't there. Caleb swore he heard his mother's voice. Eli muttered prayers in his sleep. The mountain man sat awake, staring into flames, refusing to let illusions break his focus. The storm pressed not only on the cabin, but on their minds. At one point, the doorhide tore loose, ripped open by a furious gust. Snow blasted inside, extinguishing half the fire. Caleb roared, lunging to press it shut again, muscles straining against the wind. Eli and the mountain man joined him, bodies wedged against the gap, forcing the hide back into place, tying it down with rawhide thongs. Their fingers burned with frostbite, faces whipped raw by flying ice. When the door was sealed again, They collapsed in a heap, gasping, half frozen. The fire sputtered, then caught again, climbing back to life. Victory, small and fragile. The storm raged without pause. Through the night and into the next day, it did not ease. Snow piled against the walls, burying the cabin in white. The men had to dig inward, shoveling snow back with hands and sticks to keep from being smothered. At times, they felt like moles trapped underground. Food was scarce. They gnawed jerky, chewing until jaws ached. Water came from melted snow, boiled over the fire in the iron kettle. Sleep came only in stolen minutes, broken by the groan of timber or the roar of wind. Their world shrank to a single circle, fire at the center, walls around, storm beyond. That was all that remained. On the second night, the storm reached its peak. The wind screamed so loud the logs vibrated, the chimney howled like a wounded beast, and snow pressed inward until the cabin seemed to shrink around them. The roof sagged. Dangerously low, Caleb braced poles beneath the beams, roaring defiance with each shove. Eli patched cracks blindly with frozen hands. The mountain man fed the fire until it roared, flames leaping high as if daring the storm to take them. It was the closest they had come to death without crossing the line. And then at last the storm began to wane. It happened gradually. The howling softened, the shaking eased. The fire's crackle grew louder than the wind. By dawn, the world outside was still. The storm had passed. The three men pushed open the doorhide and stared in awe. The valley was unrecognizable. Snow lay in drifts taller than men, burying trees, swallowing the creek, smoothing ridges into rolling white hills. The storm had remade the land, and in the center of it, their cabin stood, crooked, scarred, half buried but standing. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, curling into the pale morning sky. Against all odds, they had survived. Inside, the men slumped by the fire, too tired even to speak. Every muscle ached, every joint screamed, every mind frayed by hours of terror. Yet there was a quiet pride in their exhaustion. They had faced the storm's full fury, and the cabin had held. The mountain man looked around the crude shelter, the notched logs, the soot-blackened hearth, the patched cracks stuffed with moss and mud. It was ugly, uneven, fragile, but to him it was as fine as a castle, for in this place, with their bare hands, they had carved life from death, and winter was only beginning. Morning broke with a deceptive stillness. The sky was pale, the valley cloaked in silence, as though the world itself had stopped breathing. The three men stepped outside their cabin, boots sinking deep into the snow. The air was heavy, pressing down on lungs with a weight that felt unnatural. They knew this silence. It was not peace, it was warning. Birds were gone. No ravens circled, no small wings flitted in the trees. Even the creek was quiet, its icy skin unbroken. The wilderness had stilled, bracing itself for what was to come. Caleb muttered, voice low and grim, "She's Cumin, biggest one yet." By midday, the wind began. It came as a whisper at first, sighing through the pines. Then it grew into a moan, bending branches, lifting loose snow into ghostly swirls. The three men worked fast, reinforcing what they could, dragging more wood inside, stacking it high by the hearth, piling snow against the outer walls to act as insulation, lashing hides tighter across the roof beams. Every movement was rushed, frantic, as though the storm's breath was already on their necks. And then it arrived. The wind struck like a wall, slamming into the cabin with a force that rattled logs in their notches. Snow fell in sheets, blinding, relentless. In minutes, the world beyond the doorway vanished, replaced by a curtain of white. The storm had come, and it would not relent. The cabin became a fortress under siege. The wind screamed, howling down the chimney like a banshee. Smoke whirled and curled, sucked and pushed by the storm's fury. The fire sputtered but held flames. Licking defiantly at the woodpile, snow forced its way through cracks, sifting down in ghostly drifts inside. Eli stuffed moss into gaps, fingers numb and bleeding. Caleb pressed his bulk against the doorhide, bracing it against the wind's pull. The mountain man fed the fire, his face lit in alternating flashes of orange flame and grey smoke. Outside, the blizzard roared. Inside, 3 men fought for every breath of warmth. Hours passed, marked only by the dull rhythm of feeding wood into the hearth. Then came a new sound, deep, groaning creak from overhead. Snow was piling thick on the roof, heavier by the minute. Logs strained. The cabin shuddered. Caleb cursed and grabbed a pole, jabbing upward through the roof to shift weight. Snow tumbled off, but more followed, driven by the gale. The roof bowed, then held, then bowed again. It was a battle of endurance, wood and sinew against storm and ice. The mountain man stared upward, jaw clenched. If the roof goes, we're done. The fire was their lifeline, but it was also danger. Sparks leaped with every gust of wind down. The chimney, one stray ember against the dry log walls, and the cabin would become a pyre in seconds. Eli built a stone shield, rearranging the hearth to block stray sparks. Caleb fetched wet hides from their packs, laying them near the fire, ready to smother flames if disaster struck. They were men caught between 2 deaths. Freeze if the fire failed, burn if it raged uncontrolled. And still they tended it, still they fed it, because without fire the storm would win. Night fell, though none could tell when. The blizzard turned, the world black and white, day indistinguishable from dusk, dusk indistinguishable from midnight. Inside, the men lost sense of time. They worked, they dozed in turns, they woke coughing from smoke, or from the cabin's violent shakes. The wind was alive, shrieking and clawing at every seam. It sounded like voices, sometimes screams, laughter, whispers carried by the gale. In the half-dream state of exhaustion, the men heard things that weren't there. Caleb swore he heard his mother's voice. Eli muttered prayers in his sleep. The mountain man sat awake, staring into flames, refusing to let illusions break his focus. The storm pressed not only on the cabin, but on their minds. At one point, the doorhide tore loose, ripped open by a furious gust. Snow blasted inside, extinguishing half the fire. Caleb roared, lunging to press it shut again, muscles straining against the wind. Eli and the mountain man joined him, bodies wedged against the gap, forcing the hide back into place, tying it down with rawhide thongs. Their fingers burned with frostbite, faces whipped raw by flying ice. When the door was sealed again, they collapsed in a heap, gasping, half-frozen. The fire sputtered, then caught again, climbing back to life. Victory, small and fragile. The storm raged without pause. Through the night and into the next day, it did not ease. Snow piled against the walls, burying the cabin in white. The men had to dig inward, shoveling snow back with hands and sticks to keep from being smothered. At times, they felt like moles, trapped underground. Food was scarce. They gnawed jerky, chewing until jaws ached. Water came from melted snow, boiled over the fire in the iron kettle. Sleep came only in stolen minutes, broken by the groan of timber or the roar of wind. Their world shrank to a single circle, fire at the center, walls around, storm beyond. That was all that remained. On the second night the storm reached its peak. The wind screamed so loud the logs vibrated, the chimney howled like a wounded beast, and snow pressed inward until the cabins seemed to shrink around them. The roof sagged, dangerously low. Caleb braced poles beneath the beams, roaring defiance with each shove. Eli patched cracks blindly with frozen hands. The mountain man fed the fire until it roared, flames leaping high as if daring the storm to take them. It was the closest they had come to death without crossing the line. And then, at last, the storm began to wane. It happened gradually. The howling softened, the shaking eased, the fire's crackle grew louder than the wind. By dawn, the world outside was still. The storm had passed. The three men pushed open the door hide and stared in awe. The valley was unrecognizable. Snow lay in drifts taller than men, burying trees, swallowing the creek, smoothing ridges into rolling white hills. The storm had remade the land, and in the center of it, their cabin stood, crooked, scarred, half buried, but standing. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, curling into the pale morning sky. Against all odds, they had survived on inside, the men slumped by the fire, too tired even to speak. Every muscle ached, every joint screamed, every mind frayed by hours of terror. Yet there was a quiet pride in their exhaustion. They had faced the storm's full fury, and the cabin had held. The mountain man looked around the crude shelter, the notched logs, the soot-blackened hearth, the patched cracks stuffed with moss and mud. It was ugly, uneven, fragile, but to him it was as fine as a castle, for in this place, with their bare hands, they had carved life from death, and winter was only beginning. The storm had broken, leaving the valley in silence. The three men pushed open the door hide, blinking into a world remade. Drifts rose higher than men, burying saplings to their crowns. The creek was hidden under a frozen crust, and the ridge, once sharp, now looked like a rolling dune of white. The storm had reshaped the land as if the mountains themselves had shifted. The cabin stood half buried, its roof line nearly swallowed in snow. Smoke still rose from the chimney, curling lazily into the sky. Against all odds, their work had held. But survival was not celebration. It was labor, always labor. Storm's gone, Caleb muttered, voice still hoarse, but winter's just starting. The storm had left scars on their crude home. The roof sagged under the weight of snow. Some beams cracked and bent. The hides stretched across the roof were torn, whipping in tatters. Gaps had widened between logs, fresh drifts snaking through. The men wasted no time. Caleb hauled poles, bracing the sagging roof from inside. Eli climbed onto the roof, hacking away snow with a branch, shoving it aside until the beams lightened. The mountain man packed moss and clay into new gaps, sealing out the cold. Each repair was small, imperfect, but each one mattered. A cabin was never finished. That was a constant battle against the elements. The dirt beneath their feet was frozen, damp and unforgiving. It leached heat from their bodies, made sleep shallow, left bones aching. They knew a true cabin needed a floor. Together, they stripped thinner logs, splitting them into rough planks with the axe and mallet. It was slow, grueling work. Each plank had to be flattened by hand, edges shaved so they fit snugly side by side. At last, they laid them across beams set into the dirt, crude, uneven, but a barrier between flesh and frozen ground. When they spread pine boughs across it, the cabin felt transformed. No longer a pit in the earth, but a room. A place where men could stretch without shivering from the floor's chill. Luxury was unknown in the wilderness. Yet necessity bred invention. They built crude bunks along the walls, logs notched together, covered in hides. A table from split planks balanced across stumps. Shelves hammered into gaps between logs, where powder horns and knives could rest dry. Each piece was ugly, rough-hewn, but it brought order to chaos. No longer did they sleep on frozen earth. No longer did gear vanish into shadows. The cabin became less a shelter and more a home. But wood and walls could not feed them. Supplies had dwindled, jerky, nearly gone, cornmeal a memory. Hunger gnawed. They knew the truth. The storm had passed. But starvation lurked in its wake. The mountain man slung his rifle and set traps along the creek. Caleb ranged for elk sign, his broad steps breaking trails in the snow. Eli set snares for rabbits, baiting them with bark and scraps. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the crunch of snow and the crack of distant branches. That night they returned with little a rabbit, scrawny but enough to share. They roasted it on the spit, each man chewing slowly, letting every bite linger. Hunger was not sated, but staved off for another day. The fireplace had saved them in the storm, but it demanded constant tribute. Firewood was life, and life meant cutting. Day after day they felled trees, dragged branches, split logs into stacks. The rhythm became endless, axe biting, chips flying, logs cracking. The pile outside grew, but so did the hunger of the hearth. A fire in winter consumed wood like a starving beast, and every evening the stack shrank again. Caleb grumbled, shoulders aching, but kept swinging. Eli counted each log, calculating how long their pile would last. The mountain man sharpened the axe at night, steel against whetstone, knowing tomorrow's work would be the same. One truth of wilderness life was never to keep all stores in one place. If fire consumed the cabin, if enemies raided, if collapse buried their food, all would be lost. And so they built a cache, a hollow dug into the snow, lined with stones, roofed with logs, sealed with clay. Inside they stored dried meat, spare powder, parched corn. Covered with snow, it blended into the land, invisible to wandering eyes. It was extra work, hauling supplies out into the bitter cold. But it was wisdom learned by countless men before them. In the wilderness, survival was not just what you had, but what you kept hidden. As days turned into weeks, a new enemy crept into the cabin silence. The storm's fury had been terrifying, but at least it had been alive, full of sound and danger. Now, in its aftermath, came the slow grind. Days bled into one another, each a repetition of chopping, hauling, trapping, patching. Hunger never fully eased. Cold never fully left. Eli began carving marks into the wall, counting days like tally lines. Caleb grew restless, muttering about spring, about leaving for rendezvous. The mountain man said little, retreating into silence, his eyes fixed often on the flames. Isolation was no less brutal than storms. It gnawed at the mind, made small irritations swell into conflict, turned silence into weight. One night, Tempers flared. Caleb accused Eli of eating more than his share. Eli shot back, voice sharp, that Caleb's axe arm did less than the mountain man's steady work. Words turned to shouts, shouts to fists. The two men grappled in the firelight, crashing against bunks. The mountain man intervened, slamming his rifle butt into the floor. The sound cut through rage like a gunshot. He glared at both, voice low but fierce. You fight each other, you're dead men. Storm don't care who eats what. Either we live together, or we freeze apart. Silence followed. Slowly, Caleb and Eli stepped back, panting, pride wounded but spirits sobered. No more was said of it. In the wilderness, grudges were luxuries. Men could not afford. Even in hardship, small comforts emerged. Eli whittled wood by firelight, shaping spoons and cups. Caleb sang rough songs in the evenings, voice deep and ragged, but steady. The mountain man etched lines into the table, crude maps of valleys, rivers. Reducer reminder of where they were and where they might go come spring. These small acts did not fill bellies or block wind, but they filled something deeper. They gave the cabin a soul, a sense of place. They reminded the men that they were not just surviving, but living, however harshly. Weeks after the storm, the cabin stood stronger than ever. Logs sealed tight, roof braced firm, chimney drawing steady. Inside, food was never plentiful, but always just enough. Firewood never abundant, but always restocked. The men had fallen into rhythm. Chop, haul, hunt, patch, sleep, wake, repeat. Life had narrowed into survival's grind, but it was steady, and in that steadiness lay strength. The mountain man sat by the fire one night, watching sparks rise into the chimney. He thought of the storm, of the walls shuddering, of the roof sagging under snow, and he thought of now, of the cabin standing firm, of men sharing warmths instead of silence. It was not victory. The wilderness gave no victories, but it was endurance, and endurance, in the mountains, was the truest triumph. The storm had passed, the cabin stood, and the fire burned steady. But hunger still stalked the three men like a wolf circling just beyond firelight. Shelter was safety, fire was life, but without food, both were only delays of death. The mountains offered little in deep winter, no berries, no fish in frozen streams, few animals bold enough to stir in waist-deep snow. Every day was a gamble between finding enough to eat and wasting away. The mountain man chewed a strip of jerky, leathery and thin, and knew it would not last. They needed more. They needed constant supply. Survival was not about one storm, it was about the long grind of weeks, months, seasons. The rifle was their sharpest tool, yet also their greatest burden. Powder and lead were limited. Every shot fired had to count. A missed elk meant not just wasted ammunition, but days of hunger. A broken flint or damp powder could mean starvation. Each morning, the mountain man cleaned the rifle with care, swabbing the barrel, checking the lock, keeping powder horn dry by the fire. He treated it like a living thing, for in truth, it was. Their lifeline. Caleb muttered once, watching him, "Take care, O that iron, and she feed us. Neglect her, and she bury us." But rifles alone could not sustain them. Ammunition was too precious. Traps and snares were the workhorses of wilderness life. Eli carried rawhide thongs and pliant branches into the woods, setting rabbit snares along trails where faint tracks marked the snow. He bent saplings into nooses, baited with bark or twigs. patient in the knowledge that small game was often the difference between eating and starving. Some days, the snares yielded nothing but wind-blown snow. Other days, they found a rabbit struggling in the loop, its fur white against the drifts. Small, yes, but food nonetheless. Each animal meant stew, hide for patching clothes, bones for tools. In the wilderness, nothing was wasted. Caleb ranged, farther, seeking elk or deer. Tracks were faint, half buried, but he read them like a story. A bent twig, a scrape of hoof, a tuft of hair on barkage, sign whispered of movement. He followed for miles, rifle cradled, breath steaming in the cold. When at last he sighted an elk, ribs showing beneath its hide, he steadied his shot. One ball of lead, one crack of powder, and the beast fell. The echo rolled through the valley like thunder. Dragging the carcass back was labor fit for 3 men. They lashed it to poles, heaving through snow, each step a battle. By the time they reached the cabin, their bodies shook with exhaustion. But their prize was salvation meat, enough for weeks, hides for warmth, sinew for bowstrings and lashings. That night, the cabin filled with the smell of roasting elk. Fat dripped, flames hissed, mouths watered. They ate until bellies ached, savoring every bite as if it were feast, for in truth it was. But wilderness men could never think only of today. Today's meat was tomorrow's rot. Preservation was survival. They sliced elk into thin strips, hanging them above the hearth to dry in smoke. They packed cuts into snow outside, sealing them in ice. They rendered fat into tallow, stored in hides for later. Each method was crude, imperfect, but it bought time. The mountain man explained, voice low but firm. Eat like kings today, starve tomorrow. Or work today, and eat steady through the cold. It was a lesson written in frostbite and graves across the mountains. Food filled bellies, but the fire demanded its own tribute. The cabin devoured logs as quickly as men devoured meat. Each day they chopped, hauled, split, stacked. It was endless, exhausting, monotonous. Caleb joked once that they'd cut down half the mountain before spring. Eli marked logs with tally lines, trying to measure how long each stack would last. The mountain man said nothing, only swung the axe with grim rhythm, because, in the wilderness, you never had enough firewood. With supplies uncertain, rationing became a ritual. They measured meat carefully, boiling stews to stretch flavor, adding snow for broth. They chewed slowly, letting hunger ease, even when stomachs demanded more. Powder horns were counted, bullets weighed, snares checked with ritual care. Eli suggested hiding food to prevent quarrels. Caleb growled at the idea, pride wounded, but the mountain man agreed. They divided rations, each responsible for his share, yet bound by the knowledge that greed meant death, for all trust was fragile, but necessity was iron. Days blurred. The storm had tested their strength, but now silence tested their minds. Hunting, trapping, chopping it was repetition, endless and dull. Nights were long, mornings colder. Jokes grew rare, songs quiet. Eli carved tally marks into the wall until space ran out. Caleb dozed by the fire, muttering in half-dreams. The mountain man kept journals scratched into scraps of bark, notes of traps set, game caught, wood chopped, not for memory, but for sanity. Routine was both salvation and prison. It kept them alive, but it hollowed them slowly. One night, returning from snares, Eli stumbled into danger. A wolf pack had found the same rabbit trails. He heard growls, saw glowing eyes in the dusk. His rifle was unloaded, powder frozen stiff. Panic clawed his chest. He backed away slowly, heart pounding, the wolves circling. Then a shot cracked from the Ridge Caleb's rifle. A wolf dropped, the others scattered, melting into snow. Eli stumbled back to the cabin, shaken, pale. They spoke little of it, but all three knew the truth. In the wilderness, man was not always hunter. Sometimes he was prey. Weeks passed in this rhythm. Chop wood, hunt, trap, preserve, patch gaps, tend fire, ration food. It was not heroic. It was not glorious. It was survival in its purest, most relentless form. The mountain man thought often of how men back east lived with markets, stoves, neighbors close at hand. Here, every breath, every bite, every spark of flame had to be earned with sweat. And yet, there was a strange pride in it. To live on the knife edge of existence, to endure what broke lesser men, this was proof of grit. The cabin was not just walls. It was testimony. One night, as the fire burned low and the storm clouds gathered again on the horizon, the three men sat in silence. They did not speak of spring, of rendezvous, of life beyond the valley. They spoke only of tomorrows. Tasks wood to cut, snares to check, meat to preserve. For survival in the wilderness was not a single victory, not a battle won and done. It was vigilance, endless vigilance. The mountain man leaned back, staring at the smoke curling up the chimney. His body ached, his mind weary, but his eyes were steady. He knew the truth as well as the snow outside. The cabin had saved them once. Now their work would save them every day until the mountains thawed. And so, with axe, rifle, and will, they prepared for another dawn. When the first log was notched, when the first wall rose against the storm, the cabin had been nothing but survival. A barricade against wind, a shell to keep men breathing, a fragile fortress of wood and sweat. But as weeks passed, it began to change. With every log added, every gap sealed, every tool hung in its place, the cabin shifted from mere shelter into something else. It was no longer just a space to endure the wilderness. It became a space to live. And in the wilderness, that change meant everything. At first, the cabin was chaos. Gear scattered on the floor, rifles propped against logs, powder horns in one corner, jerky bundles in another. Each man slept where exhaustion dropped him, rolled in hides by the fire. But slowly, order crept in. Caleb built racks along the wall for rifles and powder. Eli carved wooden pegs to hang packs, horns, and mittens. The mountain man shaped shelves between logs, storing dried meat, flints, and small tools. The transformation was subtle but powerful. No longer did they stumble in the dark for gear. No longer did smoke-blackened hides lie across the floor. Everything had a place. The cabin felt less like a hole in the woods and more like a camp of intention. Next came furniture, crude, heavy, but comforting. Caleb split logs into benches, their surfaces rough but solid. Eli carved spoons and bowls, tools to replace fingers sticky with grease. The mountain man hammered together a table from planks, uneven legs braced with wedges, but sturdy enough to bear the weight of food and tools. They built bunks, simple frames stacked against the walls, hides stretched across. For the first time, they slept off the cold ground, spines eased, dreams less broken. Around the fire, seated on benches instead of dirt, eating with spoons instead of hands, the men felt a strange thing, dignity. Even here, in a land that wanted them dead, they could claim some small measure of humanity. Survival demanded routine. But routine, over time, became ritual. Each morning, Eli kindled the fire with care, coaxing embers back to flame as Caleb split the first logs of the day. The mountain man checked snares at dawn, his shadow stretching long across the snow. By evening, they gathered at the table, whether to eat or simply to sit, to talk or to carve quietly by firelight. These rhythms gave the cabin a heartbeat. They turned endless labor into something predictable, grounding. Where before there had been only chaos and fear, now there was structure. And structure was a kind of peace as days turned into weeks. Each man left his mark. Eli carved crosses into the table's edge, quiet symbols of faith. Caleb scratched tally marks into the doorframe, counting weeks of winter endured. The mountain man etched crude maps into the logs' valleys, ridges, rivers he had trapped along. Together, these scratches and carvings told a story that men had not only survived here, but lived. A strip of elk hide stretched across the doorway to block the wind. Pine boughs hung overhead, giving a smell of resin to smoke-thick air. Even the chimney, once a crude pile of stone, was shaped smoother, straighter. Its draft improved by careful hands. The cabin was still rough, still fragile, but it bore the stamp of human will. It was theirs. The change was more than physical. It was psychological. In the first weeks, despair had hung heavy. Hunger, cold, silence all gnawed at the spirit. But now, in the cabin's glow, despair loosened its grip. The men laughed more. They argued less. They spoke not only of survival, but of plans what to trade at rendezvous, where to trap next spring, what valleys they might explore when snow thawed. The mountain man, who had spoken little, found himself telling stories by the fire of his first elk hunt, of mistakes that nearly killed him, of rivers he'd followed farther than maps could name. Caleb listened with wide eyes, Eli with a small smile. The silence that once weighed heavy was replaced by fellowship. The cabin had become more than logs. It had become a space of belonging. The fireplace, once only survival, now became a hearth. They cooked stews in the iron kettle, tossing in rabbit, elk, even a handful of dried berries when found. They roasted marrow bones, savoring the fat. They dried moccasins by the fire, propped rifles nearby for warmth. The fire became not only warmth, but center. A place to gather, to rest, to reflect. The men sat often in silence, watching sparks drift up the chimney. In those moments, they did not feel like wanderers. They felt, for once, like men at home. Still, the wilderness reminded them daily of its claim. Food remained scarce. Firewood dwindled. The cold bit deep at night, testing every seam, every notch. But the cabin softened these blows. Instead of dread, there was resilience. Instead of endless fear, there was patience. They began to speak of spring not as a desperate hope, but as a destination. Rendezvous, trade, fresh rivers to trap. The future stretched beyond survival, yet they never forgot. One storm, one mistake, one spark could strip all of this away. And so vigilance remained, even as comfort grew. One night, as snow whispered gently against the walls, the mountain man lay awake on his bunk. He stared at the ceiling beams, smoke-stained and rough, and felt something shift inside him. This place, built with axe and sweat, was not just timber stacked against the cold. It was proof that men could shape wilderness, proof that survival could be transformed into living, proof that, even at the edge of the world, a home could be carved from nothing. The cabin was not a castle. It was not a town. It was not civilization, but it was enough. And in the wilderness, enough was everything. The cabin stood, not pretty, not perfect, not smooth or straight. Its walls leaned here and there, its roof sagged under snow, its chimney was a patchwork of stone and mud. Yet, through storm and silence, hunger and toil, it had done its duty. It had held in its rough lines, and smoke blackened. Logs lay the story of 3 men and of thousands, like them who carved survival out of the wilderness. The cabin was not just a shelter of wood and stone. It was a monument to grit, to knowledge, to endurance. When we think of mountain men, we picture them as hunters, trappers, scouts. Men with rifles slung across their backs, beards frosted white, eyes always scanning the horizon. But they were builders, too. Every cabin in the mountains was more than shelter. It was architecture born of desperation and genius. Walls rose without nails. Roofs held under the weight of snow. Fireplaces pulled smoke when they had no right to. These men were carpenters, masons, engineers without schooling, without blueprints, guided only by experience and instinct. Cabins they built, crude as they were, became the first routes of settlement. They were waypoints, refuges, beginnings of towns that would someday dot the frontier. What started as survival became legacy. Yet the cabin's story is also a reminder of time's cruelty. A mountain man had no luxury of long projects. Winter came fast, storms struck without mercy. He had hours, maybe days, to create what could sustain him for months. Every swing of the axe was stolen from the clock. Every notch cut into a log was a wager against the storm's arrival. Time was always the enemy. Too slow, and the roof collapsed under snow. Too fast, and gaps let in the cold. Success lay in balanced precision within urgency, craft within haste. Few men could walk that line. Those who failed were never remembered. The skills that made survival possible were not written in books. They were carried in memory, passed by word of mouth, shared around fires at rendezvous. How to read a tree's lean, how to angle a chimney stone, how to seal gaps with moss so snow would not creep in. These were not luxuries, they were lifelines. Lose that knowledge, and the wilderness would claim you. Master it, and you could carve a home from nothing. Today, much of that knowledge has vanished. We build with sawmills and screws, with blueprints and codes. Few of us could raise a wall with axe alone, fewer still a roof that would hold in a storm. The mountain men remind us of what human hands once knew and what they could achieve with so little. For all their reputation of independence, mountain men knew one truth: survival was rarely solitary. Yes, many lived alone for months. Yes, many prided themselves on self. But when the storm came, when the roof sagged, when hunger gnawed, men joined forces. Temporary alliances saved lives. Strangers became brothers, if only for a season. The 3 men in the cabin did not begin as friends. They did not share loyalty or history, but the storm forged a bond stronger than choice. They worked side by side, trusted one another with fire, food, and life itself. In the wilderness, that was enough. Their story reflects a deeper truth. Independence may build walls, but cooperation raises roofs. Beyond hunger, beyond cold, beyond wolves and storms, the greatest enemy was often the mind. Isolation hollowed men. Silence drove them into madness. Hunger sharpened tempers until fights flared like sparks in dry grass. The cabin, once finished, became more than defense against weather. It became defense against despair. Order, furniture, rituals, carvings were weapons in the battle. For sanity, a bunk off the ground meant comfort. A tally scratched into wood meant time still passed. A fire at the center meant there was something to gather round. To remind men they were not alone. The mountain men teach us that survival is not only physical, it is psychological. A home is not only logs and stone. It is belonging, routine, meaning. Without those, even the strongest body falters. What does a cabin represent? To the mountain men, it was a line drawn between man and wilderness. On one side, the storm, the hunger, the beasts. On the other, firelight, fellowship, a chance to live another day. Each cabin was a declaration. Here I endure. Here I claim my place, however small, against the indifference of the mountains. And though most of those cabins are long gone collapsed into earth, logs rotted, chimneys tumbled, their spirit remains. They remind us that civilization itself was built not in grand cities first, but in lonely cabins, raised by hands calloused and raw, under skies that offered no mercy. We live now in a world of convenience, heat at the turn of a dial, food at the store, walls raised by machines. But the story of the mountain men and of one cabin in Montana in 1834 asks us questions worth remembering. Could you do it if stripped of everything but an axe, a rifle, and your will? Could you choose the right tree, read the weather's signs, seal the cracks before frost crept in? Could you endure hunger, silence, and cold not for a day, but for months? These questions are not to shame, but to remind. Human beings once lived with a knowledge so intimate, so profound, that it allowed them to build life in places where no life should have lasted. And though we may not need those exact skills today, the lessons remain. That time is precious, and wasted hours carry cost. That knowledge, even in small details, can save lives. That cooperation, even among strangers, can turn despair into survival. That resilience is not brute force alone, but patience, craft, and will. The cabin of 1834 Montana is gone now, its logs returned to soil. But its story, life-etched in journals, whispered in legends, and carried in the grit of those who still seek wilderness. It reminds us that survival is not about comfort, it is about spirit. So I leave you with this. If tomorrow stripped away your walls, your heat, your stores, what would you do? Could you build your cabin not of logs, but of resilience, of ingenuity, of will? Because in the end, the wilderness is not only out there, it is inside us, too. And the question is timeless. What would you do if you had just 12 hours to build a home or freeze to death?